We are live.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to House Energy and Digital Infrastructure. It is Wednesday, February 5th, and we are here today with the auditor's office. So we are going to go our usual protocol. Committee members will introduce themselves. We'll have everybody in the room introduce themselves and let us know who they're here representing, and then we will turn it over to you for the record. So I'm Representative Kathleen James from Bennington 4, Manchester.
Scott Campbell, St. Johnsbury, Essex District.
Richard Bailey, Lamoille 2.
Chris Morrow, Wyndham, Windsor, Bennington.
Michael Southworth, Caledonia 2.
Christopher Howland, Rutland 4.
Dara Torrey, Washington 2.
Graham Plutner, Chittenden 13, Burlington.
Laura Spellier, Wyndham 2.
Jack Walker, Committee Assistant, Williston, Vermont.
Steve Whitaker.
Gail Pezzo, Chittenden 20, Colchester.
Great. What committee?
House and General.
Super. All righty.
Jackie Frazier, I'm working with Bridget Morris and represent Gainwell Technologies, Google, and others.
Great. All right. Thank you. So for the record.
Tim Ash, Deputy State Auditor. I'm going to begin, first of all, for those of you who are new, congratulations on getting here.
Yeah.
I hope you'll find that it is an amazing experience like it was for me and many others. And this committee, of course, has now decided that dealing with energy issues, climate change is not enough, that it's going to take on a huge part of the state budget, which has been mysterious and defied wrangling for at least a decade that I'm aware of, probably beyond that.
We're very ambitious.
Yes. I'm going to start with just a brief legislative story wearing my former legislator hat. And it tracks back to about 2015-ish. Governor Shumlin was in office at the time. And you may recall there was this modest IT project called Vermont Health Connect. And I don't know that anyone on this committee was serving at the time that that project had its major stumbles, but I was. And it was a horrific experience, both because of the embarrassment factor, what it signaled about state government's ability to manage what people had earlier perceived as being a fairly straightforward online enrollment system. The frustration that Vermonters had, and I was one of them, I was an enrollee as an individual in Vermont Health Connect. The experience of individuals trying to access health insurance through the system was horrible. So legislators were just getting flooded with very distressed messages for all the reasons you can imagine. And then, of course, it had, for those who had different visions of how healthcare should operate in the state of Vermont, it became quite clear that a technology project could have a very, very negative effect on something that was actually not the same thing, but people would start to put them together. So fast forward about a year, and Senator Kitchell and myself were being a little bit obstinate with the Shumlin administration because they were advocating in the budget proposal that year these huge round numbers for several IT projects, in the like 30 million, 40 million range for projects that went under different names, some of which linger today. MMIS, which is a huge Medicaid management system. Integrated eligibility, which was meant to take all of the AHS programs and allow individuals to just like get on one site and everything would kind of come together. And then a variety of other healthcare related projects. So we said we had some concerns about the state government's capacity to pull off all of these projects at the exact same time. And we were saying we might not support those items in the budget. And we got called into a meeting. I don't know if for those of you who've been called into a meeting with this or any other governor, where you walk into the ceremonial office and you've got a little bounce in your step because you're walking into the governor's office, you've been asked to be there, and then you walk in and you're met with about 6 to 10 scowling faces. That was what Senator Kitchell and I walked into. And the governor and others were saying these are really critical projects, and they were. The old legacy systems were falling apart. They didn't need to convince us of those things. And they kept impressing upon us that we really needed to push forward. We really needed to push forward. And we said, we are effectively being asked to authorize an attempt to throw 10 Hail Marys to win a tight football game all at the same time and expect receivers to perfectly catch them all at the same time. It just doesn't seem probable that this is going to end well. And we left that meeting, and it was a tense meeting. And not long after, we heard that the administration had reached, probably not as a direct result of us, but I hope we had some effect, that they were going to start to try to break up some of these projects so that they were in more manageable sizes and scales. I mention all of that because this was a time when we used to get, as legislators, something equivalent to this writing packet here. Department of Information and Innovation used to provide annually this binded document that listed all of the IT projects that state government was undertaking at any one time. And the number of committees assigned to review that was 0. There was no committee actually assigned to do that. And when you started to flip through, though, you realized we weren't talking about $10,000. We weren't talking about replacing laptops. We were talking about what had become hundreds of millions of dollars in an area that almost no legislators had any expertise. And so the evolution of committees to start having responsibility, at least in part, for IT project oversight, the creation of JITALK, which I know Representative Sebelia, I think alone on this committee, serves on at the moment, were a response to that, to try to say we have to get a handle on this massive growing part of the state government. So there's my preface to an audit that we did about a year and a half ago. So the Department of Information and Innovation used to be the manager. It kind of provided technical assistance to the different state agencies, but it didn't have full authority to really be in charge of creating consistency from agency to agency when they undertook large IT projects. When the Scott administration commenced their time in office in 2017, they believed, and the legislature agreed, that it was time for an agency to provide some overall consistency to state IT efforts. So their track record is now about 7 or 8 years in. Our office decided to do an audit, largely postponed doing an audit of how the state was managing some of these large IT projects for a few years, because we wanted this new governance structure of IT to have a little track record first. So the audit came out about a year and a half ago, and it looked at six specific projects. The names of the projects really isn't the point, because the lessons learned and some of the outcomes that we observed were pretty typical of what you would see with any of the large IT projects that the state manages. And we were specifically looking at, and I'm not great with acronyms, but the EPMO. I think it's Enterprise Project Management Office or something, but EPMO, they're the ones who are like the project managers for the big stuff. And the 6 projects are listed here for those of you who are even worse with acronyms than me. It's a Secretary of State business portal. This was meant to be a really simplified place that businesses could come in and take care of all their licensing and fees. The CCB applications, this was effectively at the onset of the Cannabis Control Board having a thing where you could get on, fill out all the applications, pay fees, and so on. Department of Liquor and Lottery Licensing and Enforcement, that was modernizing a very old system that they were using. The DCF project was about childcare payments, to put it simply. And the 2 DIVA projects, the first one was about, this is beyond my tech capacity, but like interoperability of a number of DIVA systems. And then ABD is aging, blind, and disabled. That's the term that is used to allow clients and their support to do basically self-serve applications rather than have to go into an office, which had been the case. So those are the 6 projects. And I'm not going to really get into the specifics of them because frankly, they're a little dated in terms of history, but also, as I say, the lessons really aren't about the specific ones. So for those who don't really know how the auditor's office works, most people experience the auditor's office because we release a report, we send out a press release and say government's doing these things not quite the way they should do them. The backstory before that is we have a team of auditors who follow a multi-hundred page professional manual that guides their work so that everything they do is free of opinion and sort of editorializing, and it's all just what are the facts and what is the test we're applying to those facts. So in this audit, the two things we were looking at, the first was to try to figure out whether projects were coming in on time and on budget, and if not, why. And that's looking at information provided by the various agencies that were leading the projects and also ADS. And then the second was, how is ADS determining whether effectively it's doing a good job? Is it are cost overruns and schedule overruns ones that are justified, or are they a sign that the projects aren't being managed quite as effectively as they can be? And in turn, how are they communicating that information to people like yourselves? You're responsible now for overseeing hundreds of millions of dollars of rather cryptic spending. And legislators before you have scratched their heads to try to figure out how they could determine whether they're happy with the job that's being done or not. And so those were the kinds of things that we were looking at. The short summary, oh, sorry.
I have a quick, very basic question.
Yeah.
Are folks compelled to cooperate with you?
Yes, that comes with more enthusiasm sometimes than others. But the state auditor's office has statutory ability to seek any records from any state agency who are obligated to provide it. And so this audit, like virtually all of ours, we did not have problems accessing records. Sometimes agencies will rightly say that they're swamped with something that's completely time sensitive. Our people are not unkind, so we'll often say, take your time, but get it to us when you have a free second. So
I was just curious.
yeah, so they're compelled to provide us records.
Since you're interrupted, one of the things that I'm really interested in hearing about as you go along is how, and you've alluded to this, how in the world can we possibly know whether the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars that we're spending for whatever is money well spent? It seems like an enormous amount of money.
I'm not going to finish with a flourish, but that will be hopefully hopefully where I conclude. And it won't be a clean cut. This is what you're going to do, and that's going to solve your problems. But rather, here are a couple.
How can we know if this is good value?
Yes, exactly. And that's effectively what we set out to ask those kinds of questions. So the 6 projects we looked at, basically, if you're looking at the blue bar, that is what the original cost estimate was. The orange bar is what it wound up being. And so the dollar axis is a $500,000 increment. So these are not small cost increases. You'll notice that the Secretary of State Business Portal is not listed here. That receives somewhat special note in the audit because the project was kind of an unmitigated, I shouldn't use those words. It didn't really launch despite a couple $1 million being spent on a vendor. The project just didn't happen. It caused all sorts of problems trying to retrieve funds that had been already paid for a program that didn't exist. And the Secretary of State's office has had to step back and figure out how to kind of retool in order to deliver the hoped for goals of that project. So it doesn't have an expected schedule of completion or expected new cost estimate. So we couldn't really include that in these projects so many.
And all these other ones are complete?
They are, almost all are complete.
Okay.
The childcare project remains sort of moving forward. And I'll say a little bit about that.
Great.
But you'll see that, so 3 out of the 5 here had pretty significant dollar increases. And then the Secretary of State project, I would add to that list of projects that exceeded the original estimate, because it not only exceeded it, but hadn't actually delivered anything of note. In terms of schedule, here we found that 5 of the 6 were had greatly exceeded the time frame that had been anticipated when the projects commenced. the bar. We tried to figure out how to represent it in a fair way, but those are each weeks. So, you know, the DCF project is effectively 2 years late at that point. This was back in late spring of 2023. The audit, and this gets to the complexity of it. We are honest about the reason some of these projects added some cost and added some schedule. Sometimes it's for very good reasons. The legislature, in the case of the Cannabis Control Board, changed the law and said, Cannabis Control Board, we want you to do some additional things, and we want you to charge these new fees. So that resulted in having to kind of reignite the programming process to achieve those additional IT objectives. In at least one of the DIVA cases, some of the schedule delay, if you call it a delay, was driven by the need to add some cybersecurity measures that hadn't been anticipated earlier when the project was first conceived of. So those would not be bad reasons for a project to take a little bit longer, and in some cases they might justify a little bit of expense. So we were not merely saying because it took longer that you've done a bad job.
Yeah, Rep. Southwood.
Did you identify overages based on something that was missed, something that was mismanaged?
We, each project lent itself a little bit more than others to that kind of analysis. So if you go through the audit, which is, I don't want to say it would be the most exciting read, but it's readable. It's meant to be accessible to people. You'll see that in some cases, you know, the number of project elements that hadn't been anticipated, but that were absolutely required to make the project achieve its objectives hadn't been included in the original contract. So those got added on. So it won't say, you know, $1 is associated with that particular issue, but it talks about the themes that really drove those cost overruns. Overall, what we really found, in addition to the cost and schedule, the exceeding of those estimates, was that the transmission of information to the public from ADS about the status of these projects, I used the word cryptic before, which I think is probably a pretty apt one. This is a picture from the website of ADS's EPMO from April of 2023. And if you go to their website today, you'll see the exact same format. And it was last updated, I believe, 4 or 5 days ago, the 31st of January. But what we found was, if you were, let's say you're a legislator, you're looking at this table, these projects, as you can see, some of them, the DMV core system project, $50 million. We're not talking about small things here. It was hard to know, where would your time be best spent? Which of these projects is going according to plan? Which one has been stumbling? And the system of color coding we found had no real, it wasn't for some malicious intent from the agency, but the scoring and kind of attempt to simplify how the project is going didn't have a lot of integrity to it. You could have a project that had lots of warning signs, but then in the overall column on the right would look green, and you'd scratch your head and say, how can it be facing all of these warning flags, but we're being told the project's in a good overall state? And so that was one issue that we identified when we looked at this, because this really represents the simplest view of all the large projects going on in state government.
So the marking of the green, yellow, red is, if I'm not mistaken, that's the project manager that's assigned
within ADS.
Within ADS, and it's his prerogative to put it green, yellow, red, and have an explanation as to why, correct?
At the time, the answer is basically yes. The short answer is yes. As a result of our audit, they now present the explanation of why they're scoring it green, yellow, or red. So that's an improvement that they have made, so that it takes what might have been a little bit too much subjectivity out of it and gives it a little bit more rigor. But one of the things that is a recurring theme in the audit, and remains a problem today, and one of the real challenges for this committee, is that the column that you see here that says estimated completion date, I think most people would see that and think, oh, when the project was kickstarted and funded by the legislature, this was the date that was expected to be completed. That is not what this column represents. It is the latest estimate of when the project will be completed. So a project that says January 1, 2024 could be 4 years late. But here it would say that it's right on time because that expected completion date has been changed. And so one of our recommendations had been that in all of the reporting to the public and the legislature, that ADS include the original estimated completion date, the original baseline estimate for cost, and then any revisions would be shown in a transparent way. It's not to make them look bad, but so that this type of table can be of some use to you, because it can be very reassuring to look at this and say, oh, everything looks like it's going according to plan, when in fact, there can be a lot of stumbles on the road represented in this information.
Is there with this dashboard a similar approach to the implementation dollars?
To the implementation, how do you mean?
The next column is estimated implementation dollars. Is that what was originally budgeted that's supposed to be spent period, or
That is
does that also tick upwards?
That
as the
ticks
cost?
upwards as they revise it. So if 2 years into the project, they say, whoa, this is not, we've had to add these additional layers to the project, or it's just taking extra time and therefore we have to pay more to the vendor. From time to time, they will come in and basically update these columns. And then you'll see the new estimated implementation cost.
So you also can't see at a glance there, this was budgeted at 40 million, but now it's
correct.
67 million. You would only see the 67 million.
Correct. And that has informed the purported state of play for the projects that, as it's been communicated to the public, is that new revised amount. So you can imagine never looking like you're going to miss a deadline because you just keep pushing the deadline out, or saying that it's going to be much more expensive. So you can always look like you're, batting 1,000.
Rep Bailey, did you have your hand up?
No.
Oh, you were just going through your, Rep Southwood.
Thank you. Is there a dollar amount that would trigger them to have to do an amendment rather than just ticking it upward and putting it through that?
Well, you mean a contract amendment?
Yeah.
A contract amendment, any amount would trigger a contract. How and when the agency decides to lump together what might be a series of needed changes, I can't say that with expertise, other than that it requires not only an amendment but often approval through. I could bore you about the contract approval process, but there's multiple. Basically, the Secretary of ADS has to sign off on many of them, and then the Secretary of Administration, depending on the dollar amount that's associated.
Is there ever a time when somebody would say this is going too high, do a timeout and reevaluate whether it's actually going to continue or not?
That is a question that some of the agencies would have to answer directly. I think that they struggle with some of those issues.
So just to sort of ask you, it's really interesting to know whether we're falling behind from the contract in terms of timeline or cost, but I'm also interested to know, how do we know that the estimate, $17 million, $106 million, whatever it is an appropriate amount of money? Because it just seems like an ungodly amount of money spending on software projects.
And it's not like paving a road where you kind of have an estimate of how much it costs to pave, a mile of road. It's a very different.
Yeah. So presumably ADS, that's that sort of thing. But how do we know they're doing a good job at controlling the initial contract cost?
Well, give me a moment to get to a response to some of that.
Sure. I'm just reiterating this along so that you can address it.
Yeah, I won't forget. But just to illustrate, this is a little tedious to look at from where you're sitting at the moment, but basically the previous screen, I just did a little screen snap of a few of the projects and then looked at the existing dashboard, which is up on the ADS website at the moment, and tried to pair some of the projects that appeared a year and a half ago to see the ones that are still there, just to show what I've tried to describe. So to use the example of, let's say, this workforce development. So this was not one of the projects we audited, but it appeared in the screenshot that I showed you before. The project estimated completion date was 6/30/2023. That was as of March or April of 2023. If you go on the same page today, the same exact project says the estimated completion date is 6/30/2025. So unless you, I don't know, went in the Wayback Machine or something, you wouldn't know that the project has actually been pushed out a full 2 years to be able to be implemented. The question was asked about which projects are done. The one that I said is not yet complete is the this DCF child care payment system. It does more than just that. But again, you'll see that the original estimated completion or cost was about $3.6 million. You fast forward to today, not only is the date pushed way out, but the price has gone up significantly. But again, unless you had known what that baseline was, you don't know that things have changed. It may be that if someone from DCF was in the room right now, they'd say, oh, well, it's changed because we did all the things we were going to do. And then the legislature passed a child care bill and we had to add these new bells and whistles, and that cost an extra $2 million. So with all of these, there could be good explanations. The problem is it's hard to even know when to ask the questions if the way the information is presented is a little strange. And there's, you know, like, I don't even know what to make of this one because it looks like two different projects. This is a BGS workforce information management thing. I know that they've said that they're struggling with that a little bit, but you know, you're trying to understand both why the cost has gone up, why it's at least a year and a half delayed, but then why there are two of them with the exact same information, one of which says it's going swimmingly and the other one seems like there's caution flags. So I don't want to focus obsessively about this other than to say that your challenge is to make the information more useful to you so that it actually helps you do the oversight function that you have to do, and to help the agencies succeed, because that's ultimately the goal, I mean, to make the projects, make things better for people.
In addition to suggesting that ADS add the original estimated date and original cost to their public communications, did you suggest that they add it to their dashboard?
Yes. Yeah, all outward facing, and
It would appear they have not done that yet.
that's right.
Very good.
We like when our recommendations are followed. They're not always followed, and I'll get partially to that in a bit. I don't know. I know that when I know that the secretary of ADS was here at one point, probably doing sort of a general overview.
Yep.
And in that, I looked at the slides she presented, and it did have a link to what they call like the IT activity report. The IT activity report, which is where this screenshots are taken from, is, I looked at it this morning, it's 129 pages. It's dense reading, and yet it's what half of your committee jurisdiction is about. It is all of the major projects, I believe over $500,000 are represented in that document. And it gives a pretty simple explanation of what the point of the project is, what the scope is, and then I think kind of like a where's it at. And it makes for interesting reading each project, because a lot of these are things, they're out there happening. Many of us have no idea about it, but it matters to an agency and it matters to the people that they serve. That report historically has been one of the primary ways that you would find out how things are progressing from year to year. But again, without the kind of baselines that we're recommending that they include, this is the 2022 report and then 2023 for the exact same project. So if you were looking at it in 2022, you'd say, oh, there's some things, it was running into some problems. So it's been given a yellow status. Then you fast forward a year and you look at the new report and you say, oh, everything's going well, it's green. Well, one of the primary reasons is because, as you can see, they've changed the project end date. So now it is no longer behind schedule, it is on schedule because the date's been changed. So they didn't communicate. You would have to have looked at both of them to know that that change had been made. And while the color coding is meant to make life a little bit easier for people, and that's a good thing, it only really helps if it's telling you the story in the simplest terms, but with that kind of integrity that we're suggesting.
Is the dashboard integrated with this so that the dashboard's pulling
Ooh,
from?
That's a question for ADS. I
Okay.
suspect they're separate,
Okay.
but same people are providing data for them for sure. And then this is one more instance where the your committee's oversight function would historically have been hamstrung by the way that information has been presented. So like every other agency, ADS has to present a series of kind of consistent snapshots of its performance to the state performance office. It's part of like the overall performance measurement report that the state does. And ADS continues to use the same little panel of items here. But the term on-target projects, it's the same story that I've been telling since I sat here, that talks about on-target projects based on what today's estimated completion date is, not what the project's original estimated completion date was. So you could have 0 projects that are moving along the way they had originally been intended, but then you could see a representation that says 70% of them are on target because the target's changed. And so, again, this is not, I mean, ADS has been forthcoming about this. They're not hiding it. But while it might make internal sense for them as they manage projects and hit a reset sometimes, it doesn't help you unless you know that these things are going on what they're doing. So I'm going to quickly turn to the recommendations we've made, just because I think they help speak a little bit to the questions sort of inherent in everybody's comments so far, including more direct ones from Representative Campbell. So the first recommendation, one of the things we found was that not all, the ABC form is something that many of you will never have seen before, but the ABC form is basically the form that ADS uses to put all the variables of a project in as they make a decision about whether they're going to go forward with it or not. And that's something that ultimately the secretary signs off on. The ABC form is intended to cover all the costs associated with doing a project. And when we think about that, we think, oh, the contractor that's going to get hired to have a bunch of people somewhere sit and go like this and program things. But we know that projects actually have more complicated costs associated with them than that. An example is the DCF childcare IT project that was in this audit. DCF had dedicated staff working to support the implementation of this IT project, really for the last number of years. At the time of our audit, the total had been about somewhere just under $500,000 of staff time was associated with supporting the tech side of the project. They anticipated that by the time the project was over, that personnel expense at DCF would approach $1 million. So we found that ADS was not consistently including those other agency costs as they did the sort of cost benefit analysis to determine whether a project made sense. Now, ADS's argument to us was, well, but we can't control, we don't have all the information about how that agency's working. We don't know enough about how many FTEs they're dedicating to the project. And that might be a true statement. And we said, well, then you should ask them and require them to tell you, and you should sign off on the project until you know. For some projects, talking about $1 million of state employee staff time is not small. I've seen fights to the death in this building over $10,000. So $1 million is a lot and should be included at least in the consideration. It might not affect the ultimate decision, but it is better that people know that that's the case. So
I just wondered if it was consistently not included or occasionally not included.
It was really agency dependent. Okay. Agencies that had been contemplating how this would impact them were typically coming forward, including them, but it wasn't a consistent application across the board. The second one was to work with, this speaks to what's the point of the project in the first place, which is that many of the IT projects that we looked at did not really have sort of performance measures that would allow a member of the public to say, okay, this project was supposed to improve things in this discipline. Did it actually do that? If something is meant to make the user experience, the application experience simpler, less time consuming, more intuitive, the question is, did it do those things after we spent the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars? And we found that not all agencies were including those kinds of basic accountability tools. In ADS, their feeling about this was that it was not their job to tell the agency who would host the project what the point of the project was. And we said, but you have the power to deny a project until they have articulated what the goals are. So we're not asking you to opine on their behalf, but rather use that important sign-off power to make sure that these projects have been conceived, not only conceived well enough from a programming IT point of view, but also to make sure that there'll be this accountability feature built in.
Are there across, I think I know the answer to this, I'm remembering something Secretary Riley you said. Are there across state governmental IT projects standard metrics that could be applied consistently? Or would you be saying to each state agency, well, give it some thought and come up with your metrics?
It's unlikely that you could have a one-size-fits-all in terms of what the desired outcome of a project was going to be. To take our scope of work, an applicant for a cannabis retail license has a very different view of what it looks like to be well served by that new IT project than a person applying through the Aging, Blind, and Disabled program. So you might have very different ways of wanting to gather information about the success of the project. Another example, we found that the justification for the Cannabis Control Board project was that it would bring in revenues to the state. And we said, well, of course it will bring in more revenues because you didn't exist before, so there were no revenues. You created a new thing with fees associated, it's going to collect money. So saying you're going to collect more than you used to collect isn't really a particularly powerful performance measure. In another instance, I believe it was the liquor lottery project, they said it will reduce the amount of paperwork and documents that have to be moved around, like physical copies. But it didn't say like a lot of reduction or just the most minute amount of reduction. Like what is really the hoped for outcome? If we're truly automating it, are you saying you want to reduce it by 50%? Like what is it that would be the way for us to know whether this had been worth it in the first time? So that it probably defies a consistent tool across, other than cost and schedule. That's the one place, but that's really an ADS project management measure for them to know whether they're doing everything they can to make sure projects are moving along as quickly as they can. Number 3 is really what I've been talking about, is having, whether it's on their dashboard, on their annual IT activity report, having that original baseline estimated cost and schedule so that you all can understand whether things have been going according to plan or things have changed. And that is, unfortunately, they have not done that. And they can explain for themselves why they've not done that. But it's disappointing because it really is the most, it's like in my opinion, it's like the A of ABCs of like you all basically being able to oversee their work. The fourth recommendation, I don't want to belabor this. I don't think at the time internally they weren't evaluating whether their projects were actually on time. And they're keeping track of how much is being spent. They're doing all those things, but they weren't using that as an internal tool to say, oh, we keep running over cost on these particular types of IT projects. What can we be doing a little bit differently here to avoid that moving forward? The recommendation number 5 speaks to having, when the project is being conceived, having performance measures that are set maybe out in the future sometimes a little bit longer. So some IT projects, especially where members of the public are going to be the primary intended beneficiaries, you can't know whether the project's really been successful from the public's point of view the day the system goes online. because the public hasn't yet really been served and hasn't worked out those kinks yet. So one of our suggestions, this is, I would say, a rather modest one, is to say, make sure that if it's something that is meant to serve the public or serve state employees, have performance measures and accountability that appropriately take into consideration the amount of time that it takes to know whether those things are actually succeeding. Don't look at it just as a contract that's done, so you just close the books on it. And these are, the 6th is a sort of a repetition of an earlier one that doesn't merit restating. But the 7th, one of the things we did find, this gets to one of your questions, Representative Southworth, is that we found a couple things in the 6 projects we reviewed that of note. This is more of like a pure financial auditing element. One was that invoices were being paid for stuff that hadn't actually been billed out yet. So the contracts, of course, require that the thing be delivered before you pay for it. And in at least one instance, they just hadn't managed that contract appropriately, and some money was going out the door for things that hadn't been delivered. And then in a second instance, retainage. I don't know if any of you have been in the construction industry or in any industry that has retainage, but that's a pretty powerful tool to make sure a project gets done, because it means that the owner, or in this case the state, is sitting on a chunk of change that you don't get until the project is a go. In at least one of the cases, they were just paying out the retainage along the way, so there was no, I don't want to say stick, but you didn't have the ability to hold them more accountable, because they weren't desperate for the cash because they already had it. And then let me finish this thought, just because it starts to get to the legislature. So when we met, so at the end of an audit, our team of auditors meet with the agency that's being audited. So basically we present a document that says, here's every fact that we're gonna assert in our audit. We want to give you a chance to look at it. And if there's something in here that doesn't look right, tell us so that we can fix it, or we can have a discussion about it. And so we do that with every audit as part of the government standards for this. When we met, it was the previous Secretary of ADS, so it wasn't Secretary Riley Hughes. They were very engaged, and I don't mean to say that there wasn't a lot of disagreement in the room about the general wisdom of what we had suggested. But they effectively said, we're not going to commit to doing the things that you've recommended we do, in part because the legislature hasn't required us to. So I don't mean to sound glib or playful, but it is the equivalent of saying, we know the legislature would benefit by having more accurate representations of how a project's going, but because they haven't told us that we have to be more accurate in our presentation, we're not committing to do it. So knowing that they had told us that, we added recommendations to the legislature that maybe you should tell them then, so that you'll start getting the information in a way that actually translates and is accurate. So those recommendations linger out here today. They have not been adopted by the legislature. And I can forward you guys a link to the audit report, which includes it, a little bit more discussion. But these would be the beginning of getting to the heart of the question. So let me just make a couple suggestions so I can end on a positive note about how this committee might start to do this. First, you don't have the capacity to dive into the deep weeds of every project. You're not going to look at every invoice, and it's sometimes hard for an agency to come in and say, oh, well, we have this 4-year project that we're working on. And if you hauled them in here every month and said, give me an update, they're going to be like, I don't know, some tech people continue to work on it. There's not all that much you're going to gain from that level of, of monitoring and minutia. However, there are clearly projects of significant concern, both to the public and to the committees and to the legislature. And so in the past, the legislature has been rather selective in singling out projects for greater scrutiny. The EPM, Enterprise
Workday.
The Workday thing with all the HR and finance, that is a project that JITOC was assigned some responsibility to look at in the off season. Now imagine taking that 129-page activity report and asking JITOC to do that for every one of those projects. You couldn't do it. There's just not, that's not practically going to happen. But it is also clear that when you look at the status of many of these projects, that it's not merely the shiny object, the one that's getting all the attention that justifies the kind of oversight that is sometimes singled out for a project like EPA. So it may well make sense to figure out how some threshold above which the committee believes that certain projects require ongoing report backs from ADS. It would not be a huge burden on them because it's not saying, oh, well, come in and do a demonstration and show us specifically all the things and don't bring 20 files with you. But having specific thresholds above which you're going to get quarterly written reports, something like that, which can be very conversational but accurate, so that you know when something's going wrong. And there's a precedent in the Agency of Transportation statutes for this. So the Agency of Transportation does a report, I think they call it like the 10G report, every year. I don't know if that, I'm drawing, the fact that I was able to sum that because I was a legislator. But the 10G report is intended to once a year tell the legislature, hey, here's some things that ran into snags. The project, the federal funds got shifted to something else for some reason out of our control, or you know what, we're going to pair it with another project, it'll be more economical. So you authorized it, you all debated it, it was all very exciting, but we need to let you know things haven't gone that way, and we're telling you. That does not really exist for ADS or large IT projects. It's, as I say, it's been done on an ad hoc basis, not on a consistent across the board basis.
Is that included in your recommendation?
No, that is included in Tim bringing some ideas, because I know it's not helpful to just hear that because until they, even when they fulfill our recommendations, which I'm confident with your help, they will see the light. That's still not enough. I mean, that's getting you the information more accurately than you've been seeing it in the past. But that's not really helping you then say, okay, now what are we going to do with that information? Like, what do we care to interject ourselves in? Because you can't spend every day in here talking about IT projects because you've got a lot of other stuff too. So you have to know what merits bringing people in. And then another, the ABC form that is used by ADS when they're making a decision about whether a project is a go or not, probably isn't the appropriate one for a legislative committee to be using before it decides whether it wants to support appropriations. But something like it from a legislative point of view might not be the worst idea. Having a framework by which you are going to ask questions before authorizing substantial appropriations in the budget. That can include, have you thought about what it would look like for this project to succeed? We want to hear that. We want a clear articulation of why we should give $1 million to this that we could otherwise spend on something else. That would also, I think about it almost in concert with Lisa from JFO. For those of you who don't know, Lisa is just, so she's the second person who's been under JFO's sort of umbrella to try to bring expertise and oversight of some of the more significant IT projects. But she can only do her comprehensive analysis so many times in the time that she's contracted with. So while she does the deep dive on what could be possibly a handful of projects over the course of the year, it leaves all of the others where you need to have some framework to decide whether they've met the test for you to both authorize it and then decide whether you want some checkbacks over the course of the year, whether it's something JITOC should be assigned, special oversight of maybe holding off funds unless certain milestones are met, things like that. So what that form would look like, when I say a form, what I really mean is just some framework by which you would ask the same questions of any project. So if DCF comes in and says, we've got to overhaul this old system, you're not starting from scratch each time and saying, how can I ask an intelligent question about whether we should do this? But rather it's putting it through the same test each time. Have you done the following? Have you done the following? How confident are you in this vendor? Those kinds of questions become really critical. So that's something that the committee could do that would be pretty straightforward. And I do think that the more frequent reporting in lay terms would be really, really important. The last word, and then I'll take whatever questions you might have remaining, is, the question about how is ADS and other agencies making sure that they're managing these costs as effectively as they can, and that these price tags, which are always these big round numbers, it's hard to know. It should be 39 million, should it be 38? And you feel helpless to answer that question, right? But if it was anything else in the state budget, you'd say that $1 million is a big deal to me, and I'm gonna really care. So the contract process itself is meant to get the best price. I mean, competitive bidding is meant to get the fairest price that a vendor is willing to come in for and do the project. Some of these projects there are not many vendors who do them. And so you become rather constrained. Those competitive forces aren't there to help bring down the price as far as you can. So in the first case where there are plenty of bids, I think we treat it like we treat anything else that the state bids for. You assume that the best price is going to come through that, and you honor the lowest bid as long as it's otherwise a qualifying one. These projects where it is unlikely that you're going to have multiple bidders are a different beast. And those are the kinds that, having maybe Lisa's extraordinary attention be dedicated to might make a lot of sense. Lisa, I watched when she presented to Jai Talk several months ago about the EPM project, and I know she's been back talking about it. That project actually perfectly illustrates the need to really think these things through at the outset when the funding decisions are being made. Because as members of that committee, I'm imputing what was going on in some of the minds of members of the committee, where it was basically like, we can't stop now. The project has to go forward for all the reasons that originally motivated it, even though we're not totally, there was a lot of unease in the room, and yet it was like a whatever vote, an overwhelming vote. It's hard for Lisa to come in and offer that great expertise way into the project like that and have it have the effect that it could have had in the upfront stage. So that's the kind of thing where Lisa and people like Lisa know better than the people like us when there's something that is really like a single vendor kind of project. And that might be one where you say right out of the gates, we're tentatively authorizing this, but the funds can only be released after review by, JFO's consultant, or JFO has to do a thing, and JITAC or some other group has to approve before it moves forward, to buy you a little time for that upfront analysis.
Sorry, what was the triggering criteria you had in mind for that kind of upfront?
It was, it's a little bit.
Single vendor?
Yeah, it's a little bit of an art to figure out when it's likely that there would just be a single or too few vendors to really
bid
and know that you're not really being subjected to a industry that's controlled by one company, which doesn't always mean they're going to rip the state off, but just that you don't get the competitive bidding. And I'll give another illustration. I attended a very strange and sad meeting in Rhode Island back when Vermont Health Connect was faltering. Then Lieutenant Governor Scott and I and Senator Kitchell went down and met with a series of lieutenant governors who had all met at a lieutenant governor's conference or something. And they had all been frustrated by what was going on to different degrees with their Health Connect programs. And the question was, could we band together? That was the idea. Could we come up with a multi-state solution to try to figure out a path forward? And the fellow from Connecticut, I remember it crystal clear. He was like, well, I can tell you why Vermont didn't have a good experience. He's like, you didn't get the 18. The vendor who was doing it, he's like, yeah, California, all these other states, yeah, they got the 18. You got the not the 18. I won't be disparaging in case they're somehow watching right now. But basically, that was how serious it was. He was like, oh, I know the people at that company. We said, we're only hiring you. We get this person, this person, this person. And that was how intimate it was. And so that's one of those high risk situations that an IT expert would have, and IT contracting expert would have seen. Legislators were none the wiser at the time.
Back up the slide.
I want to come here more often.
Yeah, did you have Rob Cuthbert, did you have a question?
No, I just wanted to see the other slide.
Oh, okay.
So this is it's on your website, so you can steal the slides. And I'll just offer, anytime anything that we do is of interest, just let me know. We'll try to make it as relatable as possible. I can't comprehend how much it's grown, the IT component of what the legislature approves, and it remains a mystery to most.
Yeah.
And
So I'll just say that this last few minutes starts to get at the concern that I have. How do we know whether this is a good idea to spend this kind of money? And so in essence, this business case, or this activity business case, ABC form that agencies or departments are supposed to submit to ADS to justify this project that they want to do. Somebody at ADS has got to be scrutinizing this. Then them providing a synopsis and effect of that information to us would be very useful for us to know whether it's 38 million or 37 million. I mean, right.
Yeah, when an agency comes in, and I've been on the receiving end of this just like you, when an agency comes in and says, oh, we're doing a modernization, like labor right now has this big modernization project. And I don't think anyone would say that the system didn't need modernizing, right? So it's easy to be in the audience of a presentation when someone says, oh, well, we've had this system for 40 years. It's faltering. Only one person knows how to use it. If it breaks down, we're going to have all these problems, all of which is true. And then you say, oh, well, how confident are you that this is going to be a success? Well, we've kicked the tires. You're going to hear a very positive thing because they want to believe that it's going to work out. I mean, they're sincere people. They want to do a good job. Then when things start to, hit bumps, you're not going to be the first to hear about it, right? They're going to try to work them out. They hope it'll just come around. And so each step of the way, you're always going to likely be getting something a little short of the complete picture. I mean, that's just the nature of the relationship of executive and legislative. And the problem is there's a moment where things have got to the point where you really should know that things are a little out of hand. And right now it's usually when it appears in a news story or like a whistleblower comes forward and says like things have, really gone to heck. That's when you find out. And that's not the right solution, right? That's not how you guys would do the best oversight function. So will you always ask the right questions at the beginning of a project? I don't know, but I think that there's probably been too inconsistent of an approach when agencies come forward and sell their projects. They've already done that analysis internally, so they're shorthanding it for you because they know you don't know the technical pieces.
Yeah.
And nor should you. But some basic questions like, has this worked in another state?
Yeah.
Like that's it gives you some comfort at least, right? Are we the first person to ever do this? Yeah. Or are we replicating successes in other states? Is it the same vendor? You could say, how much did they spend in the other state? Was constant, cost overruns, schedule overruns? How was that state's experience? Can we hear from that state's legislative IT person, who might have provided insights into that? So there are more opportunities than I think the legislature has availed itself of, and it can gain much with more consistency. Great.
I saw you're good.
No, I would.
Okay. Oh, I think we have two more. If you have just a few more minutes.
I'm going to close this.
Easy on.
Great. Yeah. Rick,
So, following up on Rep. Campbell's question here, comments. So, an agency comes in and says, hey, we need to have an online application process, and it's going to cost $3 million. Wow, $3 million. You get free version, and the agency says, oh, no, without that. I know for you guys who aren't IT people, $3 million sounds like a lot, but that's what it costs. There any way other than seeing what other states have done to determine whether that is in fact what it costs to get that form?
You would be best served in an instance like that, if it rose to the level of concern, to have JFO figure that out for you. They should be able to talk to Lisa, and if she doesn't have the ability to kind of get to the heart of it, that's why you have Lisa under contract to be able to guide you to those who would be able to do a straight face test. The challenge is you don't, especially when you find the case to do something versus nothing compelling. The hardest part is you don't want to just say, well, our answer is no, right? Because it's hard to do that when you know something should be changed. But I've been in rooms in the legislature where someone said, you want $3 million? We'll give you 1.5. The agency says, okay. And you wonder, are we setting them up to fail because we're not giving them enough? Or
Did they
was
come in
that like a
looking for one
hugely
point?
padded number, right? And so, but asking those questions and being unafraid to wrinkle the eyebrows a little, and that is hard to do sometimes, but it will produce a better result, especially in a collegial environment. It's not like you have to be unkind, but it's like you are owed that information, and it's not always going to be easy to get. And Lisa might tell you that Tim's dreaming to think that she could answer the question about the 3 million kind of question, but I think that she would probably be able to give the guidance.
Thank you.
An easy one. Are you currently auditing anything that we should know about or have plans to do so in the near future?
We have just released 2 audits in the last 5 days, but they're really outside this committee's jurisdiction. One was the Blueprint for Health. One was Medicaid's Program Integrity Unit, which is they look for fraud, waste, and abuse. So they're interesting, but probably not the right thing for this. But I will say the PUC, which you still have.
We do.
Yeah. So we do after audits, and the reason Representative James and I kind of contacted just to come in for this was when we do an audit, we also then follow up 1 year after and then 3 years after to see if the recommendations have actually been implemented. That's standard amongst audit offices. And so PUC, we had audited just over a year ago to determine whether their claims about how quickly they were processing through various application processes that they handle, whether the numbers they were presenting were accurate, and then to determine whether they were actually useful to anyone. And so we made a number of recommendations to them about how they could more accurately reflect how quickly they're getting projects from, submission of application to resolution one way or the other. And they adopted all. So we were very pleased a year later to say they've done it all, they've implemented it, and their reporting is now much better. It's more user-friendly, which is kind of what we're trying to achieve here. But no active one at the moment. We were contemplating looking at the EPM, but Lisa's work was so, it would have been in some ways hard for us to duplicate her efforts at the time. Maybe not of as much value. And our projects take a while. We can't be nimble the way some others can. But I'll let you know if that changes, if we come up with a project that's in its wheelhouse.
Thank you so much. That
Thank
was
you.
really helpful.